Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about the Japanese Grand Prix and the Chinese Grand Prix. During this month's race review, Dick and I discussed hometown heroes Yuki and Joe, the inevitable tension simmering between Carlos and Charles, how Fernando made the car better than it really is, how Red Bull is a good car, and in clean air, it's a great car. Mercedes seems to be beyond lost. Cherry blossoms, and upwards. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, it is another monthly race review.
It is.
Are you looking forward to it?
Oh, of course. Now, I will
even
say,
though Sabrina talks a lot.
Even though Sabrina talks a lot, I will say this: I like both of the tracks that they ran on in April, but I hate where they're located because it means races are coming on at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. It's not my brightest hour, so I've been having to watch a recording instead of watching it live. This old man just cannot do it.
I understand. I agree with you. I think I got through on the China one to be able to watch everything except the race live. And then that one, I tried so hard. I don't drink Red Bull. I actually had my first Red Bull a few weeks ago. I usually drink like Celsius if I'm going to drink anything in that type of vein. Mm-hmm. And I guess I must have forgotten to do it our Saturday in order to be able to stay up on Sunday. But yeah, I agree. The time differential makes it hard, but I think it's so worth watching these races. I'm excited for us to talk about them together. So for me, and I should give a plug to anybody who hasn't taken a moment, they should go and listen to our race notes, which we launched this month. We did a race notes for Japan in much more detail, so that's why we're not going to go into a lot of details right now. But my highlight from the month was Yuki and the hometown guy that he is, and the love that I felt his home country gave. He doesn't get that, I think, overall, because his team isn't a front of the pack team at the moment. So as a driver, I felt like it was just wonderful for him to get the appreciation. Yeah. And I love also the Japanese culture of how they approach racing. I love watching that. And so it just made me see like that has to feel good to him as a driver, that kind of visibility. And then especially it's got to carry him through the rest of the year, where unless somehow he and or his team scale that mountain and especially he gets into the Red Bull seat, it's just going to be kind of brutal for him the rest of the year. You know, the calendar is brutal. He's not maybe going to get a lot of notoriety or attention possibly. And so I feel like he does have a seat for next year. It's a question of where that seat is. I think personally it's going to still be in at VCARB. But That said, if he continues and he keeps his pace and trajectory and his emotions in check, and he drives with his mind, which is clearly there, he's shown that he has that capacity. And I saw that all those things kind of came in alignment at the Japanese race, and then for it to be harnessed in the way that it was, and for his hometown to see that, I just loved that part of the race outside of how everything landed. Okay. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I very much the same. You know, I like seeing these guys who, you know, they're probably, you know, Yuki and some of these other guys that are in cars that are not that great, you know, that they're just driving their hearts out. And they don't get the accolades that a Max or somebody like that gets most of the time. But then they have their home Grand Prix, and they actually get the love from their countrymen. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. And of course, for me, being an old school kind of guy, I really like Suzuka, mostly because anytime I watch Suzuka, I think of Senna doing that amazing qualifying lap back in 1989. And I always think to myself, now, Senna's not going nearly as fast in terms of overall lap time as what they're doing now, but you just got the feeling that with that car, that McLaren that Senna was driving, he was well over the limit what he did. Whereas it's not as obvious with the cars that we have today, which is sad. But all that said, Suzuka still kind of brings that back to me. It's a kind of a special, kind of cool place.
I think it's a fantastic track, and I'm going to give a plug for a episode that we are hoping to release soon that you, John, and I did talking about all the tracks in the calendar.
Oh
And we
yeah,
specifically, you remember that one that it's sitting in
yep,
our archives? And we talked about Suzuka and why you both of you love it and why I love it. And so that's just a future release plug. We've actually said this in the past, and then, we've had so many great conversations where we've had to decide which one gets released. This hopefully will get out sooner rather than later. And
yep,
which then leads us to a track that I don't think we actually covered in that conversation because China has been off the calendar since
yeah, for
2019. So
yeah, 5 years.
yeah, 5 years. So I want to let you go first before I give my highlight.
Sure. I mean, it's funny because again, um, we've got a Chinese driver on the grid, and you know, Joe is very much in the same situation that Yuki has. He's probably driving his heart out, um, but um, he doesn't get the accolades of the big guys. And here he is in front of his countrymen, and every time he made a pass, even if it was for 17th or something like that, the stands would go absolutely out of their minds crazy. And it's so good to see that. I'm sure that he probably could hear it even in the car. I know that there's been times when other F1 drivers have said, oh, yeah, at my home Grand Prix, I can always hear the fans, and I see them waving and all that kind of stuff. So, that had to be a big bump for him, um, especially given the struggles that his team is having right now with just keeping wheel nuts on and stuff like that. So yeah, good on him.
I agree with you. Like this hometown hero aspect of him, I think I told you this. I can't remember if I said it offline or if said it in previous conversations that we released. A few years ago, Tom Clarkson did an interview with Joe on the Beyond the Grid podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just absolutely inspired by him. And as you know, I kind of, as we get to have conversations with racers, I kind of fangirl over all of them. Which that's
Yes,
for anybody who's listening, you'll just have to know what that means in a couple of weeks, hopefully, what that means.
we've
But
got some big ones coming up, some
yeah,
really good ones. Yep.
yeah, I'm really excited. But when I heard Joe talk about as such a young kid, his decision to go and to race and how he watched his first Formula One race in China, all those different things that he talked about,
Mm-hmm.
I was so impressed by him then. And then
Yeah.
knowing the cultural and language barriers, the youth that he had, and this chosen path that he wanted to go on, I think that he has a realistic understanding of himself and what he is doing. And I think he sees himself. Obviously, every driver I think wants to be P1, but I think he realizes that he's a pioneer and he's opening up a door for others. I think that's his sense of accomplishment in his time in F1, and
Yep.
his willingness to put that in and like the effort, be grateful for it and do his best. I don't think you can ask for more from a driver, especially in the era that we're watching where Max is the runaway success that he is. What
Yep.
keeps you going week after week and doing the laps and putting your body and your mind and it at the pace that it's going and then sacrificing as you continue? I don't know how much longer we'll see him on the grid, but I believe the sport is better for having him there. And in his
Mm-hmm.
case, especially since Formula One has been more European centric, I think his willingness to open up a path for himself and others should be really recognized. And that's what, when I watch, like, even that spot that they had reserved for him on the grid at the end of the race, I was like, when I watched, I went, wait, what? What is this? And then I thought, what a fantastic way of honor
Yep.
to him, which only made for me, especially coming from an Asian background, only made sense more because of the honor culture that China holds
Mm,
to. And I
mm,
just was really glad to see like his emotion, that he's willing to have that emotion. It just humanized him in a way that I don't necessarily know that he gets his high visibility, because he is, his personality comes across as much more calm and reserved, but that
yes.
he felt that and he expressed it. It just endeared him to me even more. So I didn't have an opportunity to fangirl to him, but I am doing it right now on the podcast here with you.
That's awesome. Well, your
Thanks.
permission granted. Not that you needed my permission, but permission granted.
Thank you. Okay, so that's kind of like our individual highlights. Now let's go to the development conversations. Like,
Yep.
what exactly do you think we as fans should learn from what we're watching? Let's talk about the China race and the Japan race, whichever one you want to go.
Yeah. So I was watching the sprint race from China, and it struck me, Max qualified fourth. And I mean, it was sort of like everybody knew he was eventually going to go into the lead, right? But what was interesting to me was is that Max and the Red Bull in traffic are obviously very good, but they're not like, oh my goodness, what is anybody going to do about this guy? And yet he works his way into the lead, and that car gets into clean air, and he was gone. I mean, just gone. And so I think that in many respects, that part of the secret sauce of that Red Bull is that it is so clean. It is so good in clean air that there's a real advantage there. Plus, it's really easy on the tires, as far as I can tell. Um, if you think about some of the other teams, like last year, Ferrari, everybody was like, oh, Ferrari's pretty good, but they can't keep the tires under them. And Ferrari has solved that problem for this year. They still don't have the outright pace that a Red Bull has, but I think that they've closed the gap clearly. Um, Aston Martin, though, they're like last year's Ferrari. They're really good on one lap. Witness some of the stuff that Fernando's doing. But after about 5 laps, that car starts fading because the tires just won't stay underneath it. So it's really kind of a head scratcher, if you ask me.
I really liked what you just said. It made me write down 4 words: car, driver, team, tires. Like, if you
Yes.
have those 4 components, then optimized, then it's the puzzle pieces that
Yep.
need to be done. And I think I've been in my head really just thinking car, driver, team. I never
Yeah.
really thought about tires, but that, I think, especially watching this year's races, and I feel like you've been highlighting that, that's helping me to realize that is not something to be underestimated.
Right.
Because if the car is great, but it doesn't do well with tires, we're seeing that, as you said, with Ferrari in the past year and Aston
Mhm.
Martin now.
Right.
That's so good. Oh, that's so good, Dick. Thank you. Thank you. I
Mhm.
think that also helps because we've had our tech conversations where you've
Yeah.
done like the discussions on ground effect and arrow. Again, plugging some of our other episodes for anybody who hasn't listened to those yet. Then what do you think? Has anybody closed that gap? Personally, I don't think anybody really has truly closed the gap to Red Bull yet when we think about
Yeah, they certainly have
development.
not pulled even. Nobody's pulled even.
Mhm.
I think if you look at the qualifying times and all that, yeah, the Red Bull is still the dominant car. I think the gap to the rest of the pack might be a little bit closer. I'm talking a few tenths here. Um, but as we've discussed before, over a 50 lap race, if you're 3/10 of a second quicker in a 50 lap race, well, that's a 15-second win. And Max wins a lot of the time around 15 to 20 seconds. So, the gap is still probably around 3/10 of a second. That would be my guess. Um, so, will the field close it up? I think it's got to. Again, and I've said this before and I've been proven wrong, but it's sooner or later, there's just so much blood that can be squeezed out of that turnip that's called the Red Bull. And they're not going to gain anything, but everybody else is going to continue to find a tenth of a second here and a tenth and a half there. And before you know it, they're right there with Red Bull. So the opportunity for development, certainly with Ferrari, McLaren, and Aston Martin at this point, looks to me like I would expect to see a closer field as the season goes on, particularly as the upgrade packages start coming out. Um, you've noticed that I've left out Mercedes. We'll talk about them in a minute, but it's like I think there's really three teams. I'd like to say it's four teams with a legitimate shot, maybe not to pull even with Red Bull, but to make Red Bull's life a whole lot more difficult. Where if Red Bull gets it a little bit wrong, somebody else could sneak in for a win.
I think it's possible if we were just looking at Checo, but I think when you put in Max into the factor, I don't see anybody over like making themselves even, as you said, or somehow surpassing Red
Right.
Bull because Max
Right.
is just at a different. Now, where I could see them having an easier time is actually Checo. Not that he's doing anything wrong. I actually think
Uh-uh.
he's going into the right direction, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yep.
It seemed like in the China Grand Prix that he was a little bit more calm, a little bit more cool headed, even when he was running into issues, right? Like where he needed to overtake, he seemed like he wasn't frantic in trying to prove himself. And I wondered if he's resigned himself to P2 and said, you know what, that's okay. Like, I want this seat. I want to continue to thrive here, and changed his goalpost based off of maybe what Red Bull said internally to him. He's okay with that as best as he can, because I do realize as racers, none of you want to be P2. You all want to be P1.
Right.
But he also realizes he's competing against Max. So his willingness to say, well, then my goal is then to be better than the rest of the field, because if he's not, then it's going to look even worse on him if he
Right.
doesn't continue. So he had to kind of recalibrate himself. I think the rest of the field may be happy with that, at least for right now, while they're trying to make those development
Mm-hmm.
decisions. But consistent P3s, I if they're I guess where I'm wondering is if they're willing to take P3, because if you continue to go down, you're also going to put your money for future development at risk. So you better work pretty hard to keep that money coming, knowing that 26 is on its way. And you need
Yep.
that in the wind tunnel. Like earlier today when I was walking our dog, I was just trying to think through that a little bit of like, if I were a team principal, I've got a lot to be balancing, not just the immediate 2024 year, but 25 and 20 and setting ourselves up for 26.
Yep.
And it seems like you can't just look at your nose right in front of you. You really got to
Right.
have a horizon focus.
Yep.
So you did say that like Red Bull is still the front of the class. I know that previously offline you talked about Newey's comment when it comes to, how much you can squeeze out of the car.
Yeah, he's not buying into the idea that there's a whole lot of development left in that car. I mean, they went to the zero concept side pod and everybody was like, oh, here we go again. It really hasn't been the world beater that we thought it would be. Um, it wasn't the disaster that it was for Mercedes, but, I don't know that they're all that much. I don't know that it gained them anything. So who knows? One other thing that I was going to mention, you were talking about Checo. Christian Horner came out and said that Checo has decided to quit racing Max and is just racing himself. And that as a result, Checo's a better driver now.
I did
So
not
they're,
catch that. That
yep,
that jives with what I felt like as I was
totally,
watching him. Yeah.
totally. Yep,
I must have missed that comment, but yeah, because when my perspective in life about we've talked about actually recently about excellence and like pushing for that. I've
yep,
always felt like my biggest competitor is not anybody else, it's myself.
yeah.
And I'm always trying to outperform me.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like when you do that is the greatest level of freedom that you could ever have. but also it pushes you to the highest expectations you can ever have because you're pushing yourself to your limit.
Yep.
So good for Checo. If that's what he's doing, I
Yep.
actually think he's unlocked the psychological key personally that you
Exactly.
need. That'd be great.
Exactly.
That'd be
Yep.
great. He'd be unstoppable then. Okay, so then we kind of teased it. Let's talk about the rest of the field. What would traditionally, I guess, be called midfield or front of field, but it's kind of
Yeah.
like
Upper
P2 and
midfield.
onwards. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 What are you seeing? What do you think about what's happening when it comes to first Ferrari, McLaren, Aston Martin, and Mercedes?
Do you want to
Okay,
go first?
yes, I remain a Charles fangirl. I
Yeah.
also am a fangirl of Carlos. Here's
Yeah.
what I have to say on the Ferrari is this kind of felt like it was an inevitable situation. It was like a slow burn that I've been waiting for this to kind of come. And I felt like what we saw in China was a mini eruption of the volcano, but I expect it to get worse. But
Yes.
I think Fred Vasseur, I have a high level of confidence that this guy did not make the decisions that he, as a team principal with collaboration with Elkin and all them, did not make those decisions in the winter without anticipating this. So I
Hmm.
have a feeling they've already on top of it. Whether or not it goes the way that they think it should, that's a whole different
Right.
conversation. But I feel more confidence as this eruption happens that they've got a plan of action of how to make sure everybody doesn't die through the volcano eruption.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Ferrari has a good car. It ain't Red Bull, but they're the closest of the rest, right? Best of the rest. And we saw it in China. Charles and Carlos raced each other so hard they kind of screwed up each other's race. Um, and so I'm sure Fred's having a conversation with those boys here, if it hasn't already happened, or he may he may send them a message like three times just to make sure they know, that he means business. But I think that again, we joke, but Ferrari finds new ways to lose, and this could really be the deal. So, and that's just a rivalry between the two drivers because Carlos is driving for his career. Charles knows that he's the guy that that they're saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to have you paired up with Hamilton." And shoot, Carlos is doing a better job than Charles, really. So it's kind of like, okay, well, um, Charles is definitely under pressure. Not that he has to worry about his seat for next year, but he's under pressure, if anything, just for his own pride.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you on that.
You know,
What about McLaren? What is your thoughts there?
well, they certainly are solidly at the front of the field. I think their car is a bit track specific. We saw it in China. The car worked really, really well despite some of the concerns around the track surface itself. Um, and you just don't know what kind of development packages may be coming. Of course, I think Zach Brown, of course, is doing a great job leading that team. But I think Andrea Stella is doing a heck of a job as the team principal, because he brings that engineering mindset there. Yeah, you got to believe that McLaren or Ferrari or Aston Martin at this point could sneak in and surprise everybody and pick up a win. They're all knocking on the door. Ferrari and McLaren more than Aston Martin, but they're all kind of, they're not there, but they're thereabouts.
I think Zach Brown has something up his sleeve, and I'm excited to see that. Like we were talking about this offline. I I'm excited at the possibility of what happened at Silverstone last year to happen
Mm-hmm.
again this year, but just hopefully a little earlier.
Right.
And I think especially with the driver pairing staying the same, that gives them the level of consistency that I think they can refine their team, drivers, product, all of it in a way that gives me confidence. When I saw Lando choosing to extend his contract,
Right.
it made me initially go, "Ooh, why are you doing that?" But then watching the performance from both of them, both Lando and Oscar, which we'll talk about a little bit more specifically on the driver's performance, makes me feel that we will be surprised. This week's Chinese Grand Prix gave us that little glimmer. And maybe it is,
Hmm.
as you said, track specific, but you said that from the beginning, that the likelihood of any team just out and out dominating other than Red Bull would be challenging, but we could
Yep.
see track specific moments where teams will really harness what they know well. And we could see some people take some wins here and there. So I like that
Right.
you've maintained that consistent refrain for all of us. So then going to the next team, Aston Martin.
Yeah, I mean, and again, we were talking about it offline, but this is a team that's still learning how to win. We saw them kind of make a bit of a tire strategy blunder. And of course, I say it, and I say that in love. They have to roll the dice, right, and try something different to give them a bit of an edge. In this case, it didn't work. They had to bring Alonso in China with 15 laps to go and change tires because the car just, the car had no tires. And so, but Fernando wound up with the fastest lap of the race. So, and he certainly provided us with some fireworks. So, I'm going to make a little bit of a bold prediction here. And I'm going to say, look, Fernando almost stuck it on pole at Monaco last year. This year's car is clearly better over one lap. I think Fernando has got to be a favorite to win pole at Monaco coming up here in about a month. And if he can lead into the first corner, there is nobody going to pass that guy because he knows how to make a car wide. I don't care what kind of shape his tires are in. He will find a way to keep everybody behind him, even if they're running at a pace that a Formula Two car would be thinking is slow. and then it just comes down who can make a good pit stop. So I predict that if there is going to be an upset anytime soon, I'm thinking Fernando Aston Martin at Monaco. You heard it here first.
Okay. I'm neither agreeing or disagreeing. I'm like intrigued by this. I would love to see someone else on pole uh giving a challenge
Mm-hmm.
to Max, even though I'm like not an anti-Max person. So
Oh
let's be
yeah, I'm
very
not
clear, right?
anti-Max either. I just
Right.
want somebody to make him sweat. You
Yeah.
know?
And I think he wants that too. I think
Yeah.
he wants a little bit of a challenge. And I do see your rationale. I do think, and especially the way the Chinese Grand Prix went, Fernando, and actually John couldn't join us for this call, but he sent, or he couldn't join us for this recording, but he did send us his race notes and we'll air those later. But John really, I think, gave some really good insights as to how to view Fernando's performance in the Chinese Grand Prix.
Yeah.
And that, plus what you just said, makes me say, I actually could jump on that bandwagon. But then here's the other part. You guys also said this last year, and I jumped on then too, but not as confidently as as I am now. Like I'm a little bit more sold because now I see more of Fernando's skill in a way that I don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily know that I appreciated this time last year, which is
I
almost a
get
year
that.
ago when we started.
I get that.
You guys have helped me to see things that I don't know that as a fan who's a non-racer, I would be able to pick up on. So
Right.
that's really great. I appreciate
Yep.
that from both of you. So
Sure.
okay, let's now transition to Mercedes. My voice sounds happy, but that's actually not the way I feel right now. And
Oh
I'm
my
going to take the lead on
goodness.
this one first, if that's okay.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
I'm just I'm sad when I look at Mercedes. This confusion and lack of answers in their team, really, it just can't last much longer without affecting their morale and disincentivizing the best talent that they have from leaving before 2026. I'm concerned for Toto. I'm like, as a person who's a kind of a fan of Toto and his leadership style and all these different pieces about who Toto Wolff is as a business professional, I'm going, what's going on there? And the paddock talk may be about everyone talking about the seat that's open in Mercedes. But if I was Toto, I'd be more concerned about the factory and the team becoming demoralized and that if something doesn't happen, it's got to be plugged up like pretty hard, pretty soon.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to start having a lot of holes that is going to sink the ship. And so I'm perplexed, when I look at this situation
Yeah.
because I can't pinpoint it onto something, and other teams, when they've had their rise and fall, you can kind of look back and go, it started here.
Yeah.
But I personally don't see that with Mercedes. Do you?
Yeah, no, I don't. I just think that they just don't understand ground effects. I mean, that's all there is to it. And and I've said this before, it's no real big shock that Newey has ground effects figured out because, he spent several years in IndyCar and those cars have always had ground effect. I say always since the late 70s. And so when Newey was over here in the mid 1980s engineering cars, I mean, he engineered for Michael Andretti, for crying out loud. So he understands the basic principles. And of course, now you've got, way more new, technology and all that. And he's just applied that new technology and he's built the best mousetrap. Mercedes, on the other hand, I don't think they really fully understand ground effect. Um, and I think that they have gone down a number of development paths that just clearly did not work. Um, and to your point, if I'm Toto, I'm going to have Lewis and George making factory visits, chatting up the folks on the engineering floor and the factory floor, and doing everything you can to make sure that people are not demoralized. And how much will we get? Um, you know, Lewis involved, given that everybody knows he's leaving. So it
Yeah.
really now falls to George.
Yeah. Like literally when you just said that, I thought to myself, but is that helpful for Lewis to go at this point? I don't
Right.
know how I'd feel having that conversation or Lewis coming in and saying, great job. When you're like, well, yeah, but you're leaving. Like you and I both have been
Right.
in businesses when a colleague has already put in notice and you're like, okay, I appreciate you. You're great, but you're going. Like we kind of just
Yeah.
close in ranks a little bit. And then
Yeah.
George, I just wonder, like you, how much can he really galvanize the team when it's so many ways he's been that number two to Toto. I mean, not to Toto, excuse me. He's been that
To
number two to
Lewis.
Lewis,
Yeah.
right? And now there's conversation about the second seat, and everyone's really focused on that versus him.
Right.
And I just, yeah, I feel sorry for everybody over at Mercedes right now. I really
Yeah.
hope they can figure
I,
this out.
they won a lot of world championships, so I don't really feel sorry for them. But what I would do is I would say, why are you having such a tough time figuring this out? I mean, everybody's struggling except Red Bull apparently, but still, I mean, they're struggling. I mean, Lewis qualified at 18th in
Hmm.
China. I
Hmm.
mean, he had an unbelievable race up through the field, but even so, oh
Well,
my
and I mean,
goodness.
even everybody else is struggling, but they
Mm-hmm.
seem to, as each race, each year, they are figuring it out. Like it's not a regression, it feels like,
Right,
or like they're pulling
right.
their hair out trying to figure it out. It doesn't seem like well, I say that and then I think Alpine, but I say
Well,
that and I
no,
think of Alpine, but that's a different situation. I
yeah.
look at Mercedes and I just go, you were at the pinnacle of the sport. Where did what got, I guess it is, as you said, the ground effect, and not fully understanding it. Maybe they should figure out how much money they can throw to Adrian Newey and convince him to come over to Mercedes. That's the only thing I can think
Yeah.
of.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, Mercedes is quite different from Alpine in that they have leadership, they
Mm,
have culture, they have um, processes, um, and they know how to win. Whereas you can't say that about Alpine. And
right.
so we really are talking about different things, even though Alpine is, you know, they're in trouble too, but for a very different reason. They don't have what Mercedes has.
That's very true. Yeah, it's going to require a dramatic culture change. Like Famine is going to have to do something fast if he wants to see success, like
Yep.
in defined by race wins. Now, if race wins aren't an issue, they have the sponsors, they have the funding who aren't expecting any kind of short-term success, then you
Yep.
can take your time to do that internal,
Building.
slowly build it up kind of thing and figure out how to correct the ship in time. Like, interestingly enough, I was watching, what are these things called? Shorts on the
Hmm.
YouTube. It's this person who talks about the different cultural employment cultures inside of France and the United States. Their time off and
It's
that's
dramatic,
mandated, right? Dramatic.
right?
And I
Dramatic.
thought to myself as I was thinking about Alpine, maybe it's just as Americans, we have a different concept of success, which makes us more inclined to move more rapidly to get to that success, while the French corporate business culture has a much more longer term process. Because, like, one of the videos even highlighted, like, if you were going to be let go from your job, they have such a long deliberative process that has to be written down as to why they are letting you go, versus
Yep.
here in the US, right? We have that will employment and your employer doesn't have to tell you why they want you to leave. And so, like, those are kind of when we've talked, why I'm bringing that up. It's similar to when last year you, me, and John talked about the Ferrari culture, and it's the Italian culture, and there's a different mindset. And I think we see that populates into the way that the team is running and the team's operations. Well, in the Alpine, it's coming from a French perspective. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying is that that could be part of their way of how they want to address their issues. Their
Yeah.
timeline, maybe just
Yeah.
different than ours. But
Yeah.
all I do know is Fernando and Oscar, they're not there.
Yeah. And I do feel sorry for Pierre and Esteban, though.
Fernando and Oscar, I'm happy for them that they're elsewhere, but I do, like you, feel sorry for Pierre and Esteban. They have racing talent, and I want to see that shine through their
Yep.
cars. It
Yep.
goes back to what we said earlier: car, driver, team, tires. Got to
Yep.
get those four. We got two good drivers. Let's get the team and the car
Yep.
and the tires figured out. Okay,
Yep.
so then moving on to Kick Sauber.
Well, their pit stops look better in China. And, what happened to the engine on Valtteri, I'm not really sure. Um, I do, I do think that I have to say that in China, I was pleasantly surprised that both Joe and Valtteri at times looked pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I think maybe they're kind of figuring out their problems. I mean, they still have the nagging issue about those wheel nuts, which, I mean, it's like, really? But, beyond that, they look pretty competitive. So, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping for better things for those guys as the season goes on.
I agree. I think that I was shocked by that engine issue. I'm still no, I haven't read anything that highlighted what happened. It just
Yeah,
felt like out of the blue. But I want them to figure that and the wheel nut issue and really give their team the entire team the opportunity to score the points. And I actually
right.
have faith in their ability to do that. Like
Yep.
kind of going back to the Joe conversation earlier, I think personalities like Joe and Valtteri as well, they may not be like super in your face, but those are the slow and steady, calm and steady. Slow is not the word we ever want to hear in racing, right? But
No,
calm
right.
and steady
Yep.
personalities are the ones that you can count on. And
Hmm.
so I think that the team has the ability to figure this out. Like they have
Yep.
good drivers. Okay, so then let's talk about V carb.
That's an interesting team, huh? Um, I think it was interesting because Ricardo got a new chassis for China, and he seemed to be a little bit more, I don't know, dialed in on the pace. Yuki did a fantastic job in Japan, but China wasn't great. Ricardo wasn't all that great in Japan, and yet until he got punted, Ricardo was having a pretty good weekend, and clearly
In
he was
China.
In China, yeah,
Mhm.
and clearly it's interesting because Yuki was certainly quicker than Daniel in Japan, whereas in China the tables were swapped. So I don't know. It's interesting. You know, everybody talked about how that car at the beginning of the year, remember when the cars were revealed and all that, they were going like, oh, well, the V car or whatever they're calling it now, it's just a clone of the RB19 and all that kind of jazz. And it's sort of like, I think the RB19 would be further up the grid
Mhm.
in 2024 than the V carb. So
Mhm.
clearly, Red Bull did not sell the blueprints to the RB19 to V carb.
Right. And if they did, that doesn't help the case for either Daniel or Yuki
No,
to go into the Red Bull seat,
nope,
right? Yeah,
nope,
yeah. It is interesting that nobody's talking about that anymore. I'm glad you brought that up. I think
yep,
that is a forgotten, which is so funny because it's only been a few weeks, but it's a forgotten thought that I wish
yep.
more people would hear that and think about that. That's a good point. Okay, then let's switch over to Haas. What do you think about that?
Haas is interesting because they're kind of up and down. They're like really track specific, they seem to be. And when they have a track that suits them, or it suits their drivers, or both, I'm not really sure what the deal is. You have to start thinking, maybe you refer to Haas as being pesky because they are certainly capable of punching above their weight. What I'd be interested to know is, do they know why it is that at some tracks they're actually pretty darn competitive? A threat to take sort of an eighth, ninth, or 10th place points. Whereas in other races, they're kind of like, yeah, they're never going to get crack the top 10. Um, Hopefully they know why, but I'm glad to see them improving.
I like the word pesky and their ability to punch over their weight. I feel like they are in a much better position than they were last year. I think
Yep.
that they just need to stay steady, keep their heads cool, and they've got the building blocks. I really like Komatsu. I think that
Mm-hmm.
he is what they need right now, and
Yep.
that maybe we will see more opportunities of them punching above their weight. I was kind of surprised by Kevin Magnuson's performance or behavior, I should say, during the race in China. I don't
Mm-hmm.
really, I was trying to reconcile that compared to kind of the way that he had, was it Jeddah? Or Bahrain. I can't remember where he held kind of the whole field back behind him.
Jedi, I
And
think.
yeah, and the Chinese Grand Prix, I was like, what's going on? It felt very more aggressive than I thought really necessary
Mm-hmm.
than where he was and the way the track was evolving and
Evolving.
like
Yep.
yeah, and the way the competitors, I just was like, oh, I wonder what happened this morning. Like he just seemed like something's odd.
Yep.
But that's why I say cool heads because I think if they work in tandem, not necessarily like coordinated or team orders. I'm just saying is if he just stays steady, I think he can see some success. And
Yep.
because I think the car is going to get there, they're figuring out their car. That's my opinion of Haas. What are your thoughts on Williams?
I think I can sum it up really quick, which is flashes of promise marred by inconsistency.
Yeah.
Um, and that's inconsistency both on the Albon side of the garage and the Sargent side of the garage. I mean, Albon's crash at Australia did not help them. It
Yeah.
really put them behind the eight ball. And I think, it's impacted Albon to a degree. I think it's had a bigger impact on Sargent's mindset, maybe.
Mhm.
Um, but that all that said, again, I will say that um, they have the right team principle for this job,
Yeah.
and I have a lot of admiration for James and what he's doing and his honesty and all that. So I think they're going to get there, but it's still a big time working process.
Yeah. I like what you said. Flashes of promise marred by
Yep.
inconsistencies. I just
Yeah.
keep wondering what other skeletons are going to come out to
Yep.
tell us about where they're where
Really
they've
at.
been as a team, right? And what has been leading or what has caused what we're seeing on track. It feels
Yep.
like each race we learn something new and go, oh, I see.
Right.
But as you said, I'm a James Fallows fan as well. I do think he
Yep.
can bring them back to that former glory.
I
Okay,
do. I do.
so that's the teams. Now let's look at driver performances, kind of match them up in the team to internal team. But
Yep.
as with our last race review for the monthly format, I'm actually going to combine Max, Checo, Yuki, and Daniel. And you did talk about them
Yep.
um, in the team perspective, but let's just talk
Yep.
about them as the drivers or performances. What are your thoughts?
Well, certainly, Max is driving supremely well. He's got the best car out there. He's making the most of it. So really, not much to add there for sure. Checo, I think Checo is doing everything he needs to do to keep that seat. Again, Christian Horner saying that Checo has decided to race himself and not Max has actually made Checo better, which is great. I'm glad to see that. Um, it's really too early to tell. So I'm going to kind of whisper this just a little bit. Maybe with Daniel Ricciardo, maybe that new chassis is really what he needed. Maybe there was something that was flawed in the original chassis that he was given. And if that is the case, then maybe we're starting to see a resurgence of Daniel. He certainly had Yuki handled in China with the new chassis. Of course, when we talk about Japan, he had the old chassis. Yuki had him handled. So we'll see.
It's interesting because you and I talked about this a little bit offline as well. And I want to agree with you, but I also am reluctant to agree with you. So I'm kind of
Sure.
neutral in that sense. In that, one, I actually, as you were talking, I thought about this, the chassis aspect of it, is I feel like we've heard over the time that Daniel was brought on to VCarb, the discussion about like his driving style and that
Mm-hmm.
Helmut Marko had mentioned like there's problems that kind of have resulted from his time at McLaren. And I
Right.
guess I even got the sense of like elsewhere, like at Renault and all that. And you have to wonder if, like, going back to what you said about the chassis and everyone talking about the V carb car being RB19, I'm wondering now, listening to all of this that you've said, is maybe the car isn't really that ideal for his driving style. So the chassis does help him in whatever way
Right.
he is driving, which great for him. And then the other side of me says, but this is the guy who won the Chinese Grand Prix. Yuki
Yep.
didn't drive at the Chinese Grand Prix because I think he wasn't driving in 2019. So I give him a little bit of slack, not a
Yep.
lot, but a little bit. And
Yep.
then, but then in Japan, I would have expected him to do very well because that's his home circuit. So it's kind of like, I don't know. I feel like there's a little bit of drama to be continued. I feel like this is going to be haunting us all year long until they finally make their decision of
Yep.
either somebody's going, somebody's in, or this is where it's sitting. Like they needed to make a final answer
Yep.
because I just don't know that we have at least enough data to make a hopeful decision
Yep.
on this. That's where
Yep.
I'm landing on that part in the
Agreed.
matchup. Okay.
Yep.
Well, the next matchup, Leclerc and Sainz. What are your thoughts? We kind of touched on it a little bit, but let's go in a little bit more detail now.
Yeah, I think, we're starting to see it more and more that there's getting to be a little bit more elbows out with those two, with each
Hmm.
other, right? And so as teammates, they're racing each other hard. And I think, again, Carlos is actually delivering better results than Charles, but Carlos is the one that's been shown the door. And so for both of them, it's got to rankle just a little bit because Carlos is like, I'm doing better than this guy. I'm gone. I have nothing for next year. And then there's Charles. And Charles, on the other hand, is wanting to say, well, I need to prove to Ferrari that they were right in justifying their faith in me and not Carlos. So both of them have plenty to prove.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think
Yep.
they each have different goals. And I think though they're still teammates, it's going to be a challenge for them. But
Yep.
I believe that they can compete while remaining friends off the grid because I
Yeah,
I,
maybe.
I get the sense that they actually do like each other. I don't think it's manufactured for the social media sense.
Yeah,
But that said, they each have that fire under them to prove his worth to whoever is
sure.
watching. Like in the case that you said, internally, Charles wants to be able to prove that he was worth keeping. Carlos to
Hmm.
every other team that he would like to be able to be a part of. And they'll just need to figure out how not to harm themselves as they look out for themselves.
Yep,
Like I think that's
yep,
where even the Chinese Grand Prix being a small eruption of that volcano, hopefully they can get that under control under Vasseur's leadership.
yep,
They
yep.
are both one after the other in the point standing. So I do think that that's interesting because that was also last year. No, last year there was a bit of a gap between them. I feel like somebody was in between them, but I'm not. That doesn't strike me as a bad thing. Like it only
Right.
helps both of them if they kind of stay pretty much on par with one another, and shows that really it was a good matchup between them. Let's move on to Norris and Piastri. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think Lando is, he's showing that he's just getting more and more mature as a racing driver. Um, and I think that he's raised the bar a little bit for Piastri. Oscar's not having a sophomore slump, but on the other hand, he is marginally getting handled by Lando. And I attribute that more to Norris's experience and his maturity. I mean, Piastri's only gone around the season one time. Norris has been here for a while. And so he's showing why he's the lead driver at McLaren right now.
I think he's shown he's consistently maturing. And
Yep.
if Max wasn't in the mix, I think Lando would have already scored a number of race wins by now. Like,
Yep.
so Lando just needs to remain patient and
Yep.
hungry and smart about how he's approaching each one of his weeks. And they are both being Oscar and Lando, they're both one another right after each
Yep.
other in the point standing. So that to me, I feel like says that they're both doing what they can and just keep going. Like as we talked about these potential upgrades that
Yep.
are coming, hold steady, do whatever Zach Brown's telling you behind the scenes. Don't get too ahead of the cart. Hamilton and Russell, what are your thoughts there? We kind of talked about it, but a little bit more in depth on the two drivers versus the team dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, George he's adapted to the ground effect car better than Lewis. I mean, that's what I sense. I'm not saying that's true, and that may not be fair to Lewis. So I've got to qualify that right and left. But um, on the other hand, George also knows that this should be his team now because with Lewis leaving, I mean, it does kind of tend to point to George. So, I think he's more and more wanting to assert himself as the guy. And in the meantime, Lewis is a champion. I mean, he's certainly a very competitive guy. He recently came out and said that he wants to race well into his 40s. And so I don't think he has any interest in leaving Mercedes after such a long and successful tenure, um, and leave on a very low note. But right now, it's looking like that could very well be.
I think I wouldn't want to be in the driver debriefs. It feels like it would be absolute tension with that you could cut with a knife with
Right.
those two guys in there. And then not only them talking to the teams about where they feel about the car, but both of them and their feelings towards each other. I just can't see any level of not camaraderie because I realize that's not realistic in the racing sense, but
Right.
like the necessary teammateness that you need to have in a racing team. I just think it's probably gone. I mean, George is significantly ahead of Lewis in points. That
Mm-hmm.
cannot be sitting well with Lewis.
No.
And Russell has this question of who will be his teammate next year. It clearly wants to get more points from the car and he wants to make it very clear that he should be leading it, like you said. But for both of them, the car isn't there. And that has got to be frustrating to both of them.
Yep.
I
I
just
agree.
can't see it's got to be good. So I do feel sorry for them. Their performances, I think, are maybe as good as we think it could be with the car. I feel like it's not showing us going back again back to car driver team tires. I don't feel like we can quantify
Uh-uh.
any of those right now
Right.
because it seems like every element of that is under disarray. But then we switch over to Alonso and Stroll, where
Yep.
that's not necessarily the same dynamic. There's some
Mm-mm.
positives there. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So obviously, Aston Martin keeping Fernando for another couple of years minimum. That's a huge win for Aston Martin, I think. Um, Fernando is driving extremely well. I mean, you only have to look at the start that he made in China and the fact that he just almost got ahead of Max on the second turn of the race. He would not have stayed there. Let's not kid ourselves. Max would have, whistled past pretty quick. But the fact that Alonso had the moxie to make the moves that he made, um, showed a lot, right? And so um, you got to also wonder about how long is Lance going to stick around. I'm not knocking Lance, but the fact of the matter is that the performances between Alonso and Stroll are so big that he's got to be costing Aston Martin constructors money at some stage. They've got to, I don't know what's the difference between third in the constructor standings versus, I don't know, fifth or sixth, but I mean, it's got to be millions and millions of dollars. And so, um, when will the shareholders and stakeholders at Aston Martin start saying, yeah, we need somebody else? I don't know. I don't know. It may be that Lawrence has such a big hammer that he carries around, and I have no doubt he does. Maybe Lance will be around for a while, but right now, you kind of got to wonder, man, is he really bringing his best?
I think Alonso staying is a huge win for Aston Martin. And I wonder if when you talk about, Lance and Lawrence Stroll's influence, I have to wonder if Alonso sees that too, what you're saying.
Yep.
And maybe there's conversations in the background about how all the team it feels like is being carried by Alonso. And the more you watch him, the more I think is, wow, what would it look like if he had a teammate that could be on par with him? That's just like you, not knocking Lance. If he's bringing his best, it's just not enough right now. It is what it is. You're also going against a champion. I just wonder maybe that timeline is coming shorter. I maybe they'll make that decision because of the rules change and maybe they want to see these packages enhance this year and give him the best car that they believe that they can before they make that final decision. I
Right.
could see that would as a I'm just thinking about a parent who has invested as much as he had in his kid's dream.
Yep.
You have to wonder where he probably says as a businessman, I do want to make sure my kid gets the most so that way we can look back at this joint project. And I say that because in actually I watched this season of Drive to Survive. Remember, I told you I binge watched it because I knew I'd never watch it again if I didn't sit down and just watch it all. And he made a statement, he being Lawrence, made a statement that this was a project for him and his son.
Yeah.
And I wonder if he just wants to be able to check off every box because once Lance walks away, it's not like he's going to return back like Alonso. And so he wants to make sure that they've done everything. That's my suspicion, at least.
The part is that might be interesting is maybe Lance needs to take a page out of Checo's book and quit trying to race Fernando and instead race himself.
Ah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah, it could be that key again for him.
Yep.
Okay. Well, then another person who I think has, until Japan, I would have said this person was racing against himself, which is Alex Albon.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have said the same advice to his teammate, Sargent, of you need to just race yourself. Don't worry about anybody else. Just do your best. What are your thoughts about Alex and Logan before I give you mine?
Well, I think Alex is incredibly talented. He's been um, I don't know. It's almost like he's trying too hard. He had a good season last year, and it's almost like he's trying to say, "Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet," you know. And he knows there's that seat open at Mercedes, and so he's got to be eyeing that thing, right? Um, but he's been fast but inconsistent. Um, and I don't know how much of that is the car, how much of that is, he's got a repaired. Well, Logan's driving a repaired chassis. Are we having a little bit of a Ricardo thing going on here with their chassis? Um, it's hard to say. And then you take a look at Logan. Man, I want to cheer for him. I want to see him do well. Um, but at the same time, again, he probably needs to just race himself and not worry about staying on track with Albon. He still has not outqualified Albon. Um, the gap is closer generally, not always, but generally closer. Um, but and then the other side of the coin is that, hey, Logan is in Formula One, which is more than I can say, and so it's just sort of like, Logan, just continue to remain calm, work on yourself, race yourself, work on your consistency. I will say I do not understand the penalty he got from passing Hulkenberg under the pace car. I think it was a really close call to begin with. But because it was under the pass was made under the pace car, why didn't they just say, hey, Logan, give up your position to Hulkenberg? What is so hard about that? Instead, they slap him with a 10-second penalty after the race. And then, it really impacted the race. Very weird. Very weird.
I was wondering as you said that, I wonder if they had made any rules change. Remember, they were making a lot of these penalty rules changes from last year to this year. I feel like the
Yeah.
drivers had said that they didn't like some of the stuff that was happening, and so
Mm-hmm.
they decided to do that. That's the only thing, but I'm like you, it still seemed kind of weird, and I didn't understand why they didn't give him just the place back and just moved on, and why it seemed
Yep.
so kind of harsh in comparison to some of the other stuff that we were seeing. I
Yep.
do feel like Alex is carrying the team, but like you said, he's not consistent like Fernando. If we're
No.
talking about drivers carrying the team, I do think Alex wants to be that person, whether it's for Williams or Mercedes or whoever, but he
Yep.
does not have the same experience as someone like Fernando.
Right.
Not to mention, like, the team does not have the same, you can't see my air quotes, but good fortune as Aston Martin does of like their finances, their
Right.
system, their leadership. So, as much as Alex may want to, he just is not placed in a position where I feel like he can carry it just kind of lone man doing it. And then
Yep.
with Logan, I really want to cheer for him like you do. I really want him to do better. I just wonder if he's been put in an unfair position, unfair again in air quotes, in the sense of he's still in the Formula One grid. That's saying something. It's
Yep.
just that the stopwatch, as you and John have reminded me over and over, does not lie.
Nope.
And I'm just wondering if this is the best Logan can do. And if that is, just like I said with Lance, it's okay. He made it there and he's giving his best. And I'm proud of him for doing what he is doing. We will discuss this topic in subsequent conversations, probably
Sure.
about like how hard it is for Americans to get onto the grid. So
Oh
like
yeah.
just like I'm cheering on Joe for him getting onto the grid and representing China, I want to cheer on Logan for what he's doing for Americans who are trying to
Yep.
get onto the Formula One grid. Thinking about Miami, which is the next race, I hope Americans can get behind and cheer Logan and see what he is doing. He's maybe not the first American on the grid, but he is the American on the grid. So we should have
Yep.
some patriotic pride for the kid and
Yep.
what he's trying to do.
Yep. Agreed.
Instead of going through all the rest of the field, not that I don't believe in any of them, but I don't necessarily know that today we need to go into as deep of a conversation, but I'm going to lump Valtteri and Joe, Nico and Kevin, Pierre and Esteban in a moment for us to talk. Here, I'll give you my take and then you can tell me what your
Sure.
thoughts are. I think these teammates each affect one another. In the case of Valtteri and Joe, I think they have such a positive, congenial way about them that it helps their team to progress forward and hopefully figure out the other areas that they need to figure out. With Nico and with Kevin, I kind of see them as like employees of the team and saying to themselves and to each other, like, stay in your lane. And if needed, I'll let you know if I need your help. Otherwise, just let me do my job. We've got a lot of fish to fry. Let's just not make it any harder. And then with Pierre and Esteban, I see them as frustrated young professionals wanting more from their company, but knowing it's chaos and dysfunction, but there are no other options right now. So they just continue to push forward. In all of those scenarios, the Valtteri and the Zhou, it's a company that's doing good, but it's not great. But good to great can be done if you just figure out the building blocks, how to refine them. With the Nico and Kevin doing that, where you say stay in your lane, that can work for a time, but eventually you have to have better cohesion and unity amongst your teammates for you to become good. To be good, you have to have that unity of mind. And then with the Pierre and Esteban analogy, like companies that I've seen that, people are frustrated. Frustration can only go so long before it just implodes and you lose bright, young, talented people. And so I look at these teams and I go, oh, I hope we don't see them go down, but they figured this out. As I said, I do think that Haas leadership has the ability to bring them into that unity. I do have some hope for Kicksauber helping Valtteri and Joe, however long those two are matched up together. And then the only one that I have a question on is Alpine. Like, what are they doing? I don't know,
Right.
but their timeline may look very different in their minds than it does for me
Yeah.
because I'm coming from an American perspective.
Yeah. No, I think you pretty well nailed it. I would add Nico and Kevin are not exactly buddies. Then when we start talking about Pierre and Esteban, well, they've got some pretty rough history between the two of them. Now, I will say this: I'm proud of those two guys because they actually have done a very good job of keeping the professionalism and not letting their personal animus boil over. Hey, man, I'll give them full credit for that, especially given how difficult their circumstances are.
So then let me ask you, if I'm a new fan, what should I keep in mind regarding these races?
Well, I think it's the fact that those two races are sort of your ultimate flyaway races. I mean, they're like we talked about before. I mean, with the time zone differences and all that, it's tough to watch those races. And so it really, really shows just how global F1 is. I mean, you think about it, those two races plus Singapore plus Australia, those are about as difficult a race for an American to watch as you're going to get.
Mhm.
Um, and the tracks are quite different in that Suzuka is an I won't say old school, but it's certainly a legendary circuit that's been around for quite a while and is a track that all the drivers look forward to going to. China is a much more modern track. It's got some very interesting sections to it, but it is a very, very different kind of circuit. But in both cases, the fan support is just crazy. I mean, the fans are switched on and they're excited.
They provide like that hometown feel that we started their conversation with for these
Yep.
racers who often get overlooked in the pantheon of F1 drivers. I think that
Yep.
that's so cool about this and like thinking about this month of racing. And I do like the fact that you highlighted these races, the distance and how it affects us. Like we shouldn't, I think, at
Yep.
the rest of the year have to get up as early or stay up as late, whichever way you want to look at it, to
Right.
watch this. So that's kind of good. I like that. Let's get it out of the way and then realistic time
Hour.
to watch it for us in America. But
Right. Of
talking about the track itself, I wanted to share some notable facts that I saw that I thought were kind of cool. Can I geek out a little bit?
course. Go.
Okay. I really love the Chinese track. Well, I love both tracks, designs and the way that the turns, all that. I look forward to the Suzuka one especially, but China, especially because it's been so long, I wanted to look at it a little bit more. What I researched is not only do I like the design being pleasing to my eye, it's apparently designed to look like the Chinese symbol for Shang, which means upwards. I thought that was kind of cool, like it's
Interesting.
in Shanghai, and I
Yep.
guess that's part of the reason why they chose that symbol. I love turns 1 through 4 or sector one. I love those curves and watching the cars make the adjustments while they're keeping pace. That's every time the cameras would cut to that, no matter if it was qualifying, if it was the sprint or the Grand Prix, all of it. I would get excited when we got to see that because I thought that's not something I felt like we see during the rest of the calendar, those kind of circular loops kind of feel to it.
Hmm.
Maybe I'm mistaken. Also, I love turn 16 right there. Yes, there is the gravel, and we saw Fernando, Hamilton, others, I think even Max at one point, all kind of they have that slip into the gravel, just the tail end would come in. But that was so much fun watching them whip around that corner and we could see it from the straight. I told you the soft line. I just would get giddy watching that. I thought that was the a cool aspect of this. It reminded me of Barcelona and the new
Mm.
changes that they made at the end of the track. I feel the same way when I watch that. So that's some notable facts that I wanted to throw in there. And then about the design and how it affected this race, I think that the time away that we haven't had in specifically at the Chinese Grand Prix was interesting because it handicapped the quote newer drivers, not necessarily rookies, but people who did not have the opportunity
To
to
race there.
race since
Yeah.
we've been not been there. And then our seasoned drivers, i.e., like Fernando and Lewis and others, or Daniel, they knew this track, and I think it gave them an advantage to that. So I
Yep.
thought that was interesting to look at the Chinese Grand Prix in that perspective. And then with
Yep.
Japan, I have to say, I loved that the cherry blossoms were out. I thought that was, as a person who loves the cherry blossoms in DC, and
Hmm.
just it feels ethereal when you're walking in those. I thought to myself as I was watching this year versus the past few years when it's been raining, I thought, well, that was a pleasant thing for those people to feel like racing in cherry blossoms. How cool
Yep.
is that?
Yeah, I think agree with you on all things. I liked your fun facts on the Chinese. I had no idea that it's designed with the Chinese symbol Shang involved. So it shows you what I know. Um, I would also say it would be interesting to know, and I don't know, but it would be interesting to know for the newer drivers just how much time did they spend in the simulator driving the track at China. Um, you know, was the data that was last collected in 2019, would that data have been valid this time around and all that? I mean, I don't know, but at least the simulator would give them a general idea of which way the track went, and that's got to be helpful.
Oh, that's a good point. That's a great way to end the conversation, Dick. Leaving us all in this quandary of like,
That's right.
I
I don't
like
know.
it.
I don't know.
Awesome. Okay, well, this ends our conversation for the month of April. Hopefully, we will be able to talk about the next month, which brings us to the United States for the first time on this calendar. I'm looking
Yep.
forward to that. And now for John's Chinese Grand Prix race notes. Very well done, Red Bull. Lots of talk about nothing significant in the end regarding the resurfacing. Mere distraction from the competition. Conditions were the same for everyone. Lots of good racing throughout the field. Fans should enjoy this because it doesn't happen often through a season. 2 drives of note, and they are from the same team, Aston Martin. Stroll was moments of brilliance and gave one of the best wheel-to-wheel demonstrations in a long time, but destroyed this positive by running into the V-carb, showing his lack of maturity for which there is no excuse with his considerable experience. And then there was the driver who outshone Max, Alonso. His skill, commitment, and bravery was apparent every lap. He wisely gave up position when he didn't have a realistic chance in favor of the long game. His move on the outside on lap 1 was brilliant, and he repeated this type of move over and over. In my humble opinion, he stole the show, deserved driver of the day, and his final move exiting the last turn showed his unparalleled car control. This is well demonstrated by comparison with Sainz, who lost control in the same situation the previous day. Watch Fernando's hands on replay and appreciate the unbelievable reaction time and the calmness with which he saved it. Thank you, Fernando, for a thoroughly enjoyable race from start to finish. He showed his great value to F1, even at 42 years of age. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysagirlandf1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.